I probably will echo a bit on both David and Paul's comments earlier, in that I'm going to talk a bit about risk and opportunity, and obviously it is actually a practical impossibility to buy a piece of land that isn't directly connected to a TfL asset, obviously just by the very nature of the fact that they're next to roads. It's a truism that we stop making land. And by definition, it's the single most important thing that we need in terms of developing. So actually, it's actually pretty easy to find land that you can put development on. So the trick is actually finding land which is affordable, which you can get a consent in a reasonable amount of time. And getting it at a rate that you can afford to buy. So it superficially pretty easy, but actually land is very, very tightly held in London, either by public bodies. I'll come on to that in just a moment. Conscious of the fact we've had a couple of public sector speakers already today, but also by the private sector. And in the private sector, it tends to be very broken up, very disjointed. It's difficult to aggregate. That's expensive. It's time consuming. It's very, very difficult to do. On top of all that, landholders in London are very, very, very aware of the latent value they have in their land. And somewhat annoyingly, from a development point of view, they spend time gaining a planning consent to crystallise that value as well. Often that planning consent isn't actually very useful for a developer who's willing to take risk. And on top of that, they use valuable local resource planning time in getting that consent as well. So doubly frustrating. We've seen two really good examples earlier on in terms of both what's going on in Newham and also Old Oak Common. And Old Oak Common is actually fascinating. And if anybody hasn't walked around it, it really is worth doing, just in terms of how difficult development is actually going to be to do there. It's so difficult to move around. And the vision is spectacular. I happen to know what good looks like because I led the team that built the Olympic Village, which is an incredible 2 years of my life. So I know what the outcome looks like. But it's a pretty sad fact of life that there is no compelling reason why a developer should be the first mover in an area which is regenerating. Outside of normal market returns. So unless you can see a really good return there, there's actually no compelling reason why you should go first. There's also no disincentive to holding out and going after everybody else has created the value around you. So there's no stick and carrot approach, generally speaking, applied across London. And therefore, I suppose the first real plea is that whilst we will go out there and be purely opportunistic, it needs to be strategically directed somehow at a local and a regional government level. So there's been a bit of talk about brownfield registers today. That's fantastic in terms of it being a list of land that can be developed. But to go back to my first point, I can just walk around London and find that all the time anyway. So actually, it needs to be coordinated with planning policy. It needs to be coordinated with infrastructure investment, and we heard a lot about that. And also, it needs focused incentives as well. Now, I am going to be quite quick because I'm conscious that everybody needs to get away. But while I've got the soapbox for a minute, there's a lot of public land out there. And it's interesting, and here's a plea from the heart, that this public land is held by one government department, but actually 9 times out of 10, they're fighting other government departments. So I think the lady from Old Oak Common has left now, so I can probably get away with this comment. But interesting that the high point of her tenure so far was the transfer of land from one government department to another government department. So obviously, last time I looked, they had the same share price, and this morning it went down, but it's another comment, so there you go. So whilst there's a whole heap of factors, practical factors that we have to overcome when we're developing a piece of land, okay, the government landholder is trying to maximise the value of that land. Meanwhile, other government departments are trying to apply, and you'll forgive me for looking at the list, they're trying to apply stamp duty and land tax, VAT, GLA CIL, local CIL, probably an additional levy on the forthcoming infrastructure that's coming, Section 106 obligations, affordable housing, and probably starter homes, but we don't quite know what that looks like at the moment. So they're trying to maximise the piece of land, but then they're applying all these taxes on it as well. And the two don't quite marry up. They have a negative impact on viability, and that the government agency, will just still try and push the land value. Meanwhile, and I'm very conscious of the people that are still left in the room, thank you for staying with us, that is all generating fees for you, because we need consultants to advise on all that. So that's great for you guys, but not so good for me. So a brownfield register then really is just the start as far as we're concerned. It's how it's utilised and incentivised that pays the real dividends. So the next thing we look at, having secured a piece of land which is viable, is securing consent. And actually securing a consent on a brownfield piece of land is as easy or as difficult as it is on a greenfield piece of land. So I'm not going to teach anybody anything new here at all. However, for us, it's all about balancing time, resources, and cost against the certainty of outcome. And that is it's a huge issue for us, and I'll come on to that in why it's such a problem and what it means for most of you in terms of working with someone like me as we go forward. I think just a couple of comments. The general consensus, and this is probably be borne out by other people in the room, is that planning departments are under-resourced now. So they've seen the problems of the last 5 years. There's been huge cutbacks. It's very interesting to see that we can now perhaps take another route under the new Act. I'm not quite sure what that looks like, but most developers will tell you that they're paying for planning officers directly now anyway. There also seems to be a high degree of movement in terms of the planning officers around councils, and that's not very helpful. There's no continuity or consistency. And whilst there's been some moves to help us in terms of time, the prime one would probably be the reduction in the judicial review period, which is very, very helpful. There's still an awful lot more that needs to be done. First world problems, there's nothing worse than a developer bleating about the fact that planning is difficult. So we've secured our land and we've secured our consent. We then need to secure our returns, and there's probably 3 areas that we'll look at in terms of how we secure our returns. The problem for a developer is 9 times out of 10 we have to put all of our money up front on a piece of land, and the cost of that land is crystallized by our analysis of all the factors up front. And what is really unhelpful is a consultant telling us the worst it could possibly be, or the best it could possibly be, because quite frankly that's really unhelpful, because what we're being asked to do then is either looking at all the best cases or all the worst cases. And on the one hand we make a lot of money, and on the other hand I'm sacked, and my investor's looking for a new managing director. So what we really need is a risk-weighted return from every single consultant that we work with to tell us the most likely outcome. And many consultants are averse to do that. But actually the best ones are those that will put their front foot forward and say, look, here's one bookend, here's the other bookend, but if it was my money, I'd be betting on this middle ground here. Because then we can look at all of that and we can apply those most likely cases, and that will give us a much better risk-weighted outcome, which means that then we can afford to put a proper bid on a piece of land. And remember, once we crystallize that cost on the land, everything else follows through on that. So we then take sales risk, we take planning risk, and we take cost risk as well. So I'm not going to teach everybody to suck eggs, but in terms of this risk-weighted approach, looking at planning and outcomes and viability, we're taking a risk on the number and size of homes, tenure mix, affordability levels, disability allowance, so how many of those homes need to be for disabled access, daylight and sunlight considerations, Section 106 considerations, sustainability requirements, flooding controls, secure by design, local employment obligations. If we take a particularly dark view on all of those, we won't be paying much money for the land, which means we won't win the piece of land from the land vendor and somebody else will get in. Probably a sovereign wealth fund from Southeast Asia, given where the pound's gone today, and they'll just sit on their hands and they won't use a local workforce anyway. So it's actually in the interest of, certainly from my perspective, London-based consultants to help London-based developers actually win pieces of land, because then you'll get work. What's in it for me? Beyond that, in terms of securing returns, we move on to site works, and I'm not gonna insult you by running through those, but those are all of the things that we have to make a decision on before we buy the piece of land, and put a cost to and a risk-weighted allowance to. UXO, for those that might not know, is unexploded ordnance, unexploded audience, perhaps, I don't know. And then finally, and lots of pictures of railway lines, you'll note. That's very good. In terms of looking at the interfaces with the local community and the local competition, parking restrictions, community relations, regeneration perception, that's developer speak for gentrification, which obviously is a word which is laced with emotion, and we tend to I'm really happy to talk to all communities about it. In fact, welcome the opportunity to do so. But obviously there's usually very strong feeling about any sort of change in any sort of community, and we touched on that earlier on today as well. Road safety with particular regard to cyclists, and that's a huge thing now for any developer who has a hoarding up with a sign saying that this is us and we're developing, and they've got cyclists and trucks moving onto sites. That's a recipe for disaster if you're not managing your fleet properly. As a cyclist, I can say that. Rights of light, party walls, utilities, and all the rest of it. So we need to take a risk-weighted approach on all of those right from the start. So just tying that all together, these are pictures of our site in Deptford, by the way, which we start just finishing demolition. We start construction in the next 3 weeks. Brexit pending. Moving on. Identifying suitable land is easy. Transacting effectively is much more difficult. There's no such thing as a standard brownfield site or even a standard development model, wherever anybody tells you. And it's highly competitive out there. Reconciling risk and opportunity is essential if we're going to be successful in buying the land. And I would encourage all of you to try and work with UK-based developers. Here's the UK PLC bit, because we employ UK consultants to get us across the line and help us with the final development outcome. That's it. Short to the point.